Hello, friends. Welcome to Empty Cloud Monastery. This morning, we're here with Bhante Suddhaso, who will be sharing some words of Dhamma. And welcome to Geeta, Poonam, Aaron, good to see you, Jayanta, Mike, Kumu, welcome, friends. And without further ado, I'll pass it on to Bhante. So if you have any questions at any time, feel free to type them in and we'll pass them on to Bhante Suddhaso.
So we'll start by paying homage to the Buddhas. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Good morning and good evening to our viewers on the other side of the world. Today we'll be going through a discourse from the Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 7, sutta number 68. So this is the Dhammannu Sutta, which is translated here as knower of the Dhamma. So as usual, I'll read through the sutta and periodically I'll stop and give some explanations of what the sutta is talking about. And then at the end, you can ask whatever questions you have and I'll do my best to answer them. So the sutta begins. This is presumably the Buddha talking. It says, monks, a monk who has 7 qualities is worthy of gifts, worthy of hospitality, worthy of donations, worthy of respect, an unsurpassable field of merit for the world. What 7? Here are monks. A monk is a Dhamma knower, a benefit knower, a self knower, a moderation knower, a time knower, a group knower, and a knower of the various kinds of people. So this opening, first off, he's introducing what is it that makes a monk truly worthy of the support of others? And what is it that makes it so that people who support that monk generate the most karma possible, the best good karma possible? So what makes a respectable monk? What makes a worthy monk? And then he gives the table of contents for the sutta. So this is a common thing that we see in many suttas, is at the beginning, the Buddha he'll just briefly give table of contents. He's like, these are the points I'm going to talk about over the course of this Dhamma talk. So here he's introducing 7 kinds of knowledge, 7 kinds of knowing. At first glance, some of these seem relatively straightforward, such as a Dhamma knower or a self-knower, but some of these are a bit more obscure, which is why we'll need to see how the Buddha defines each one of these terms. So the first one, the Buddha says, monks, how is a monk a Dhamma knower? Here are monks. A monk knows the Dhamma, discourses, chants, explanations, poems, exclamations, quotations, stories of past lives, marvels, and interviews. So this list here is the way that the Buddha's discourses were originally categorized. So originally the Buddha's discourses were categorized into these, I think 9, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, yeah, into these 9 sets. So in Pali, this is sutta, so discourses. Geya means chant. Geya can also mean song, by the way, but in this context, it probably means chanting. Vyakarana means explanation. Gata means a poem, such as the Dhammapada. The Dhammapada is the most famous collection of Buddhist poetry. Udana is exclamation. So there's actually a whole book which is called Udana, and it's just a collection of times when the Buddha gave some inspired exclamation related to something special that happened. Itivuttaka means quotation. And again, there's a book from the Pali Canon called Itivuttaka. It's a collection of quotations from the Buddha. And technically, most of the Sutta Pitaka is quotations of the Buddha. Jataka means a tale of past lives. So normally when we say Jataka, we're talking about occasions when the Buddha spoke about his own past lives and the things that he did in his past lives in order to develop the qualities necessary to become a Buddha. The next one on the list is Abhuta Dhamma, which means something marvelous, something wonderful, something amazing. So for example, when the Buddha is talking about the various amazing or remarkable qualities of awakened beings, or when he's talking about descriptions of the different heaven realms or different spirits or celestial beings, those could all fit in this category of marvels, wonderful, magnificent things. And finally, the last one is Vedalla, which is translated here as interview, but you'll also see it translated as question and answer sessions. There's a handful of suttas that we have which are still called Vedallas, and they take the form of a Q&A session with one of the senior teachers from the time of the Buddha. Two of the most famous ones are the Chula Vedalla Sutta, which is a series of questions to the Arhat Bhikkhuni Dhammadinna, and the Mahavedalla Sutta, which I think is a series of questions to Sariputta. Is that right? Don't think so. I might be wrong. Does anyone recall? Doesn't matter. Anyway, point being, these are the 9 categories of suttas from the time of the Buddha. These days we use a different categorization system, which was invented a few hundred years after the Buddha's passing. So the Buddha says, monks, if a monk does not know the Dhamma, discourses, chants, explanations, poems, exclamations, quotations, stories of past lives, marvels, and interviews, then they cannot be called a Dhamma knower. However, if a monk knows the Dhamma, discourses, and so on, then they can be called a Dhamma knower. In this way, one is a Dhamma knower. So this is a very simple definition. How can you say that somebody knows the Dhamma? Well, if they know the suttas, if they're familiar, if they have read the discourses of the Buddha, if they have a thorough intellectual knowledge of the Dhamma. So they've read a lot of, preferably all, of the Sutta Pitaka, the collection of the Buddha's discourses. So elsewhere, the Buddha defines the term Dhamma knower in slightly different ways. So talking about having a deep, wise understanding of the meaning of the words. But here he's giving a very simple definition, which is just that you've read the suttas. But the simple definition is not to be skipped over. So over the years, I've met quite a number of people who are quite convinced that they know the Dhamma. And they say, oh, well, I don't need to read the suttas. I already know the Dhamma. But then in the course of conversation, it becomes pretty clear that, in fact, they do not know the Dhamma. And the fact that they've convinced themselves that they can understand the Dhamma without reading the suttas is exactly what's preventing them from coming to a genuine understanding of the Dhamma. So it's not to be skipped over. Reading the suttas, studying the suttas, contemplating the suttas, discussing the suttas, this is not to be skipped. This is a very important component of coming to a genuine understanding of the Dhamma. Then the next one, the Buddha says, and how is one a benefit knower? So the word benefit is a translation of the Pali word atta. So atta has a range of meaning. So benefit is one meaning of this word. It also can have the meaning of goal or destination, target, what you're trying to get to. So the word atta, it's sometimes used in just an ordinary sense, like something that helps you achieve your goal. And so maybe your goal is to eat 20 hot dogs in an hour. Well, that would be an example of an atta that's pretty mundane and pointless, but it would still fit the meaning of the word. Atta can also have the meaning of benefit, in the sense of, oh, I did this for your benefit. I did this for you. Or the sense of something that's beneficial. So, for example, the Buddha says that when speaking, we should only speak words that are atta sanghita, words that are connected with the benefit of the people involved, words that bring benefit to the people involved. But sometimes in the suttas, the word atta is used to mean the final goal of spiritual practice. In other words, it's used as a synonym for awakening or for enlightenment. So keeping that range of meaning in mind, the Buddha says, how is one a benefit knower? Here, a monk knows the benefit of any kind of statement. This is the benefit of this statement. That is the benefit of that statement. Monks, if a monk does not know the benefit of any kind of statement, then they cannot be called a benefit knower. However, if a monk knows the benefit of any kind of statement, then they can be called a benefit knower. So this also I find interesting in that it's pointing to kind of carrying on from the previous one. So reading the suttas is all well and good, but it's important to understand what benefit comes from reading the suttas, what benefit comes from knowing the statements of the Buddha. For example, why did the Buddha talk so much about karma and rebirth? Why did the Buddha talk so much about generosity and morality? What's the benefit of those kinds of statements? But also reflecting on our own speech, our own statements. Whenever we say anything, we should be asking ourselves, what is the benefit in this statement? Is this going to bring benefit to myself, benefit to others, benefit to both? And what kind of benefit is it going to bring? Is it going to bring us closer to awakening? Is it going to bring us closer to the final goal of the Buddhist path? Is it going to lead to the development of serenity and happiness and wisdom? So we should always be, and then also when we hear other people's statements, when we hear what other people say, we should be making a similar investigation. Like, what is the benefit of this person's statement? Is what they're saying connected with the Dhamma or not connected with the Dhamma? Is what they're saying in accordance with Dhamma or in opposition to Dhamma? So applying the same examination, what is the benefit of this statement, both to what we say and also to what other people say? Then the third category, the Buddha says, how is one a self-knower? And it says, here a monk knows themselves. I have this much faith, morality, knowledge, generosity, wisdom, and inspiration. So in Pali, these words are saddha, so faith or confidence, sila, which is morality or virtue, sutta, which is knowledge. So in this case, it's usually defined as knowledge of the Buddhist discourses. Chaga is generosity. Chaga, by the way, also has the meaning of letting go. So chaga, it kind of blends together the two words dana and nekama. So dana means giving, and nekama means renunciation. So the word chaga contains both meanings, both the meaning of giving away something and also letting go of something. So chaga we normally just translate as generosity, but it's important to remember that it also has the connotation of relinquishment, of letting go of things. The next item on the list is panya, which is translated here as wisdom. You'll also see it translated as discernment. And elsewhere, the Buddha defines the term panya in various ways, but one of the most common ways he defines panya is in terms of knowing impermanence. Knowing that all things are arising and ceasing. All things are inherently insubstantial. All things are conditionally arisen and conditionally cease. And the final term is patibhana, which is translated here as inspiration. It can also be translated as creativity. But the meaning of this term is like the inspiration connected with the Dhamma. So the tendency of the mind to be inspired by the Dhamma, and based upon that inspiration of the Dhamma to produce something that expresses that understanding, expresses that inspiration. So most commonly where we see the term patibana used in the suttas is when somebody hears the Dhamma and they get some understanding of it. And then they'll say like, oh, I've had this patibana. And the Buddha will say, okay, express your patibana. And then the person will give like a short Dhamma poem. So short, they'll compose a spontaneous poem expressing their understanding of the Dhamma. So in this case, this indicates how the word patibana contains this meaning of both inspiration and creativity, but with a distinctly wholesome connotation. The connotation of inspired creativity related to the Dhamma. And then the Buddha says, if a monk does not know themselves, I have this much faith, morality, knowledge, generosity, wisdom, and inspiration, then they cannot be called a self-knower. However, if a monk knows themselves in this way, then they can be called a self-knower. And he recaps. He says, in this way, one is a Dhamma knower, a benefit knower, and a self-knower. So just recapping the 3 points that he's made so far. So this also points to another important element of our practice, which is self-reflection, self-reviewing. So constantly examining our own mind and our own conduct and asking ourselves, well, how much faith do I have? How much confidence do I have in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha? How much confidence do I have in the training? How much confidence do I have in the path to awakening? So constantly reviewing the extent of our own faith and our morality. So we should always be examining our conduct. What are we doing? What are we saying? Is it wholesome or is it unwholesome? Is it skillful or is it unskillful? Is it helping people or is it harming people? Is it leading towards awakening or away from awakening? We should always be examining our conduct and considering how can we be more virtuous? How can we be more in line with the Buddhist principles of morality? And our knowledge, we should be asking ourselves, how much do I know of the Dhamma? How good is my understanding of the Dhamma? What can I do to improve my understanding? So also reflecting, it's like, well, even if you've read all the suttas and you think you know them pretty well, then ask yourself, what aspects of the Dhamma am I still a little unclear about? And then go and find some senior teachers and ask them questions about it. So you might be like, well, I've heard of this whole dependent co-arising thing, but I don't really get it. Maybe I should go and ask some questions. Or you're like, well, they're always talking about rebirth, but I don't really get how that applies or how we can understand this. So then go and ask questions. So wherever there's some lack or some weakness or some haziness in that knowledge. And reviewing our own generosity and asking ourselves, where am I stingy? Where am I hesitant to give? Where is there weakness in my generosity? And what can I do to improve that? What can I do? How can I be more generous? How can I be more willing to let go of things and for the benefit of others? And with our wisdom, again, wisdom is not just knowledge, but it's a deep experiential understanding of the Dhamma. So again, you might reflect and think, well, I know the Dhamma intellectually, but I haven't really experienced what it's talking about. So then you're constantly applying those principles of Dhamma to your direct experience. So what is your direct experience of the Four Noble Truths? What is your direct experience of the 3 universal characteristics? What is your direct experience of causality? So examining our experience through the lens of Dhamma is what leads to the arising of wisdom. And the deeper our understanding is, then the more our inspiration from that understanding will arise. So also reflecting, how much ease do we have in expressing the Dhamma? How much joy do we have in discussing the Dhamma? And if we find that actually we don't particularly like talking about Dhamma and we're not so interested in expressing our understanding, well, then that's a bit of a problem, isn't it? That's something that needs to be examined. We need to look more closely. Like, what is it that's holding me back from a deep appreciation of the Dhamma? And often it just has to do with not living a life of Dhamma. So if the Buddha's teachings are only an intellectual construct in our mind, then that's not actually very satisfying. There's an expression in the Zen tradition, eating a picture of rice doesn't. So this is pointing to, again, somebody who reads Dhamma books but doesn't actually practice it. It's like somebody who's trying to satisfy their hunger by eating a picture of a bowl of rice. Doesn't actually do very much good. So we should be making this effort to live the Dhamma. And as you live the Dhamma, then your inspiration, your joy, your appreciation of the Dhamma will become deeper and stronger. So constantly examining ourselves in terms of these 6 qualities. How much faith, morality, knowledge, generosity, wisdom, and inspiration do we have? And always trying to build up our weak spots. The next one, it says, how is one a moderation knower? So in Pali, this term is Dhammannu. So Dhammannu just means one who knows the right amount. So matta means amount or measure. So sometimes in English, when we say the word moderation, then people immediately think that moderation means having less. It means reduction. But that's actually not correct. The word moderation actually just means middling. So not too much, not too little. So the word moderation actually means the right amount. It doesn't mean reduction. Unless you're prone to excess, in which case moderation would mean reduction until you get to the moderate level. But actually, if you're so when we talk about moderation, again, this Pali word is mattanyu. So matta means the measure, the right amount, and anyu means knower, or nyu means to know. So mattanyu means knowing the right amount. So the Buddha says, how is one a moderation knower? Here monks, a monk knows moderation when receiving robes, alms food, dwellings, medicines, and medical supplies. So this is called a monk's basic requisites, the basic things that we need in order to survive. So robes, we need robes to wear. If you're a lay person, then you probably don't wear robes. I certainly hope you don't. That's a big problem. If you're a lay person wearing monk robes, that's quite a problem, actually. But lay people have their own clothing that they wear. Food. So for monks, this is alms food. So the food that is donated to us by other people. Lay people normally buy their own food or acquire their own food in their own way. Next one is dwellings. So in Pali, this is actually a really fun word. So senasana is from 2 words. Sena, which means lying down, and asana, which means sitting. So senasana literally means places where you lie down and sit down. So we translate that as dwelling for the sake of convenience, but it's good to keep in mind it literally means sleeping and sitting place. And the final item on the list, it's translated as 2 items, but it's usually considered a single one. So galana pachaya besaja parikara, which means medicines and medical supplies. So the things we do to take care of our health. So these are called the 4 requisites, the 4 basic things that you need in order to survive. And in monastic life, we are encouraged in many places in the Pali Canon to consider what's the actual minimum that we need. Do you have some rags to cover your body? Well, good enough. Do you have some discarded leftovers that someone put in your bowl? Yeah, good enough. That'll keep you alive. Do you have a tree that you can sit under? Well, okay, you've got a dwelling place. That's great. You can sit under a tree. Medicines. Do you have some natural medicine? Something you can gather from nature? Something simple? Well, then that's good enough. Either you'll get better or you'll die. So we're always reflecting. What's the actual minimum that we need to get by? And everything else is extra. But we also consider, again, as I mentioned before, moderation means not too much and also not too little. So if you actually do really need a robe, then being realistic, I need a robe. I'm freezing to death. I'm getting assaulted by mosquitoes. This is not working out so well. I need a robe. And you find a way to get a robe. And you do so in line with Dhamma. So as monastics, we have many rules about the proper way to get things. We can't just walk up to some random person and be like, hey, yo, give me a robe. Like there's a way that we have to do things properly so that it's always coming from the other person's generosity rather than from us imposing on people. Similarly, if we're not eating enough, then we should eat a bit more. Or if we're eating unhealthy food, then we should try to eat healthier things. Similarly with dwelling places. So if you're in a tropical country, then yeah, you can sit under a tree. That can be your home. If you're living in Canada, well, you can only get away with that for a couple months of the year. Otherwise, you're going to freeze to death. So dwelling place, you might need something a bit sturdier and fancier with a nice heating system. Similarly, medicines. Again, being realistic. What's actually helpful? What's supportive to our health? So not going overboard, but also not rejecting medicine when it's necessary. So I had a friend a few years ago who contracted a serious degenerative illness and was not willing to take medicine for it. And I remember talking to him and telling him, look, you really need to go to a doctor and get this taken care of and get the right medicine. And he was like, oh, there's no point. There's no point. It'll be fine. And it was not fine. He wound up sustaining actually quite serious damage to his health because he waited several months before getting treatment. So that's an example of someone who in theory, they're practicing equanimity, but in actuality, they're just practicing foolishness. So the reflection on the four requisites is one on being realistic. What actually is the right amount? When is the time to practice equanimity? And when is the time to go out and get some more medicine or some more food or another robe or whatever? And of course, this is aimed mainly at monastics, but these same principles apply to lay people. So asking ourselves, where are we going beyond what's really necessary and just getting wrapped up in desire, in excess? Or where are we unnecessarily tormenting ourselves by not letting ourselves have what we need, not letting us have what's helpful to us? The next one, the Buddha says, how is one a time knower? Here amongst, a monk knows the time. This is the time for an exposition. This is the time for a question. This is the time for application. This is the time for retreat. This one I find very interesting. So the time for an exposition, so the Pali word is uddesa, which normally the word uddesa refers to the introductory statement at the beginning of a sutta that is laying out, again, kind of the table of contents or the outline of the discourse that's to come. But sometimes the term uddesa also just means a short explanation of something, a short explanation of some aspect of the Dhamma. Then this is the time for a question. So recognizing that, again, so there's a time for giving a talk. There's a time when we should share our understanding of the Dhamma. And there's also times for asking questions. So this also is very important. In many places in the suttas, the Buddha says that the condition for the arising of wisdom is that periodically one goes to a senior practitioner and asks questions. So very simple. In other words, we should never assume that we already know the answers. We should never assume that we already have perfect understanding. But rather, we should always be asking ourselves, when is the time to share what I think is the Dhamma? And when is the time for me to ask questions about Dhamma? Then the next one, this is the time for application. So the Pali word here is actually yoga. So in Pali, the word yoga has two rather different meanings. So the most common usage of the word yoga in Pali is actually in the sense of imprisonment or bondage, or being tied to something, being bound to something. Attachment in the sense of a seemingly inescapable bondage to something. And the other usage of the word yoga is in terms of commitment or dedication to a particular practice. So, for example, the Buddha speaks about Atikilimatanu yoga. So the yoga, the commitment to self-torment, which the Buddha said is useless. It doesn't bring you any good. Dhamma is not about tormenting yourself. But the point is that that's a case where he's using the word yoga to mean being committed to something, being dedicated to something. And that's how it's being used here. So he's saying there's a time when you should talk about the Dhamma. There's a time when you should ask questions about the Dhamma. And there's a time when you should just commit yourself to practicing the Dhamma. So not engaging yourself in either speaking or questioning, but just committing yourself to doing the practices. And then the third one, this is the time for retreat. So in Pali, the word is patisalana. So also the Buddha, in a number of places in the suttas, he talks about the importance of spending time alone, spending time in solitude, in seclusion, in silence. So getting away from human voices, getting away from duties and distractions, and spending time with your own mind, understanding your own mind, examining your own mind. So knowing these four times. So when is it time for an exposition, whether for you to give an exposition or for you to listen to somebody else's exposition? When is the time for questions? When should you ask questions about the Dhamma in order to help clarify your understanding? When is the time for application? So just really committing yourself to practicing the principles of Dhamma that you know in whatever situation you're in. And when is the time for retreat? The time when you need to take a break from other people, you need to take a break from duties, you need to take a break from activity and busyness, and just be by yourself. Be quiet and alone for a while. Then the next category, the Buddha says, how is one a group knower? And it says, here a monk knows a group. This is a group of aristocrats. This is a group of Brahmins. This is a group of householders. This is a group of contemplatives. So these are four kinds of people. So this is one way that one can divide up people. This is not the four castes, by the way. This is a different way that the Buddha sometimes used to speak about sectors of society, segments of society. So the first one, the Khattiya Parasa, the aristocrats, the ruling class, the powerful people in society. So this might be politicians or business owners or people who have significant power in society. The Brahmana Parisa, so the group of Brahmins. So the Brahmins were the priests, the ritual specialists. At that time in India, it was the precursors of Hinduism. So the priests, the precursors of the modern Hindu priest caste. But it could also be taken more generally in terms of priests or ritual specialists of any sort. So religious practitioners of any, religious clergy of any particular religion. A group of householders, so Gahapati Parisa. Gahapati actually quite literally means householder, so lord of a house. So these are people, ordinary lay people. So the term householder is commonly used to mean like just ordinary everyday lay people, like the 99%, like all just the ordinary people that you run into in your life. The people who are doing the ordinary things of getting a job and paying their bills and maybe trying to have a family or whatever it is householders do. Watching TV all the time, drinking beer, the householder stuff. I hope you don't do any of those things except the job. You need to make money some way, but the rest of the stuff is pretty meaningless. Jobs are meaningless too, but you have to pay your bills. And then the final category, so the samana parisa. So the group of contemplatives. So samana is a word which means anyone who has left behind ordinary worldly pursuits and has committed themselves entirely to spiritual practice. And it's interesting that the Buddha makes this distinction between the priests, the ritual specialists, the religious ceremonial clergy, versus the samanas, the contemplatives, people who have left behind involvement in social hierarchy and social engagement, and instead are thoroughly committed to spiritual practice. Similarly to the distinction one might make between a priest and a monk. So a priest is still very much involved in society, whereas a monk has left society behind in order to develop a spiritual practice. And again, this is not just Buddhist monks, but also monks and contemplatives from any religious tradition could be called samanas. So he says, regarding these four groups, one knows there one should approach in this way, stand in this way, act in this way, sit in this way, speak in this way, and be silent in this way. In other words, this is quite interesting because the Buddha is basically saying that we should understand the different social groups that exist in society, and we should try to have some understanding of the basic social conventions that each of those groups uses. So that if you go and you are around a particular group of people, that you have some general idea of the way that they expect you to behave and the way that they expect you to speak. And you have some idea of how to act and speak in a way which is not going to be too offensive, and to act and to speak in a way which is generally speaking going to go relatively smoothly. So you don't necessarily need to be an expert in the precise social customs of Argentina, for example. Nothing wrong with Argentina. I was just picking a country name at random. You don't necessarily need to be familiar with the Freemason rites or anything of that sort. Like, it's not about knowing the intricate details of any particular social group, but rather having a general understanding of how to speak and behave around different kinds of people. And always doing so in line with Dhamma, of course. So our first commitment is always to the Dhamma. It's always to living and breathing and speaking the Buddha's teachings. But we adapt to the social conditions that we find ourselves in to the extent necessary, that we minimize conflict. Of course, conflict cannot be completely avoided. There's many cases in the suttas of people arguing with the Buddha and criticizing the Buddha and spreading malicious gossip about the Buddha and insulting the Buddha. And of course, the Buddha is completely unmoved because he's confident that he's simply acting in line with Dhamma. So he knows that there's no valid reason to criticize him. So in the same way, like, we don't necessarily need to compromise our principles of Dhamma in order to accord with the social conventions of the group that we're with. But we should at least have a general understanding of what the social conventions are. We have at least a general understanding of how to interact with people in a relatively inoffensive way. or at least to be aware when we're behaving in an offensive way. Then finally, the last category that the Buddha gives, this is the longest explanation, so bear with me. This is going to take a few minutes, and then we'll switch to Q&A. The Buddha then says, how is one a knower of the various kinds of people? And he says, here, monks, a monk knows people by pairs. And he's going to give a list of several pairs of two kinds of people. And it's progressive. So this is actually all one continuous teaching, even though it's presented as being sets of two. He says, there are two kinds of people, one who wishes to see noble beings, and one who does not wish to see noble beings. So noble being means somebody who's made progress on the path to awakening. So here it doesn't refer to aristocracy, but rather it refers to spiritual attainment, so progress on the spiritual path. And he says, the person who does not wish to see noble beings is blameworthy because of that. The person who wishes to see noble beings is praiseworthy because of that. It's a very simple statement. There are people in the world who are completely uninterested in spirituality and have no interest whatsoever in meeting people who have spiritual attainment. And the Buddha says, well, that's a blameworthy trait. That's something which is worthy of criticism. When somebody has no interest in meeting spiritual people, that's a problem. But somebody who is interested in meeting spiritual people, oh, that's praiseworthy. That's wonderful. Next he says, there are two kinds of people who wish to see noble beings. One who wishes to hear the good Dhamma, and one who does not wish to hear the good Dhamma. The person who does not wish to hear the good Dhamma is blameworthy because of that. The person who wishes to hear the good Dhamma is praiseworthy because of that. So the term translated here as good Dhamma, in Pali that's Suddhamma. So the prefix sat can mean either good or true. So this could also be translated the true Dhamma. So the good Dhamma, the true Dhamma. So there are some people who they want to go and see spiritual practitioners, but they're not actually interested in learning anything from them. They might tell you awkward things like give up alcohol. That would just be horrible. So you just want to see them, maybe be inspired by the soft glow around them, bask in their gentle speech or their grumpy speech in my case, and then go about your day without actually learning anything. So there are people who have this attitude. They want to just see the spiritual beings, but they don't actually want to listen to them. That would be most inconvenient. Next he says, there are two kinds of people who wish to hear the good Dhamma. One who listens carefully when hearing the Dhamma, and one who does not listen carefully when hearing the Dhamma. So as somebody who gives a lot of Dhamma talks, trust me, I know the difference. So I've had times when people came and it was time for the Dhamma talk and they're just like, okay, bye, Bhante. And you realize like they actually weren't really listening. Like they were just doing their duty of like, oh, you go and you give the stuff to the monk and then you have to wait while the monk says a bunch of boring stuff, but they'll be done soon and then you can leave and get about with your day. And it's like, well, okay, it's praiseworthy that you took the effort to go and visit the monks. That's good. But it would be even better if you also listened carefully while they were talking. That would be like super good, really good. So of course the Buddha says, one who does not listen carefully when hearing the Dhamma is blameworthy because of that. And the person who listens carefully when hearing the Dhamma is praiseworthy because of that. So again, we should really make an effort to pay close attention when listening to the Dhamma, to really try to understand what's being said and to reflect on its meaning, to consider how it applies to our life. And then he says, there are two kinds of people who listen carefully when hearing the Dhamma. One who remembers the Dhamma after hearing it, and one who does not remember the Dhamma after hearing it. The person who does not remember the Dhamma after hearing it is blameworthy because of that. The person who remembers the Dhamma after hearing it is praiseworthy because of that. In other words, we should also be making an effort to imprint what we hear on our mind. so that we don't just lose it right away. We should really be trying to remember what we hear. So this also comes from the previous one. If you're listening carefully, paying close attention, that it will make a deeper mark on your mind. If you're connecting it with your life, exploring how it applies to your life, then it will make a deeper imprint on your mind. And these things help you to remember it more clearly. Also, engaging in discussion and questioning also helps you remember things more clearly. Also, people sometimes take notes during talks. That's also a way of helping you remember, helping you pay attention and remember. So you do whatever you have to do in order to remember the Dhamma. Because if you don't remember it, it's not doing you that much good. Then next, the Buddha says, there are two kinds of people who remember the Dhamma after hearing it. One who examines the meaning of the Dhamma that they remember, and one who does not examine the meaning of the Dhamma that they remember. And of course, the one who does not examine the meaning, he says, is blameworthy because of that, and the one who examines the meaning is praiseworthy because of that. So here again, maybe you go to see the monks and you listen to the Dhamma and you remember the Dhamma, but then you're just like, whatever, cute words, and then you just get on with living your life the way you did before you went to see the monk in the first place. So that's not so helpful. Or you hear something and you just store it of like your list of facts that's buried away in your memory somewhere. Again, that's not so useful. The point of learning the Dhamma is to examine its meaning and understand its application. So we should be constantly pondering and reflecting and considering the meaning of the Dhamma that we've heard. So calling to mind the Dhamma principles that we remember and examining the meaning of them and the application of them. Next he says, there are two kinds of people who examine the meaning of the Dhamma that they remember. One who practices in accordance with the Dhamma after knowing its meaning, and one who does not practice in accordance with the Dhamma after knowing its meaning. So again, somebody, they might be reflecting and they're like, okay, so as I understand the Dhamma that I've been taught, it's saying that I need to relinquish my attachment to all things. Oh, that sounds terrible. Yeah, I'm not going to do that. And then they just go on living their ordinary dukkha-full life that they've been living all along. So there are people who, even after understanding the Dhamma, they still don't want to practice it. They're not interested. So here the Buddha is making this distinction. Of the two kinds of people who understand the Dhamma, there are those who really try to live in accordance with Dhamma and those who don't. And of course, those who don't are blameworthy because of that. And those who really do try to live in accordance with Dhamma are praiseworthy because of that. And then the final pair, and this one I find especially delightful. He says, there are two kinds of people who practice in accordance with the Dhamma after knowing its meaning. One who practices for their own benefit, but not for the benefit of others. And one who practices both for their own benefit and for the benefit of others. The person who practices for their own benefit, but not for the benefit of others, is blameworthy because of that. The person who practices both for their own benefit and for the benefit of others is praiseworthy because of that. So I find this particularly delightful because it's emphasizing the compassionate quality of Dhamma practice. That we practice not just for our own benefit, but for the benefit of all beings, for the benefit of everyone that's affected by us. So we're constantly considering, how can I be of benefit to everybody in my life? So one of the accusations that's sometimes leveled at Theravada Buddhism in particular is the accusation that we're selfish. The accusation that Theravada practitioners are self-centered and only interested in themselves. But this is one of many, many places in the suttas where the Buddha points out that that's not a correct understanding. This is one of many, many suttas where the Buddha points out that somebody who's only interested in their own benefit is someone who does not understand the Dhamma. Somebody who's only interested in their own benefit is not practicing the Buddha's teachings. But rather, we should always be trying to be for the benefit of ourselves and others. for both self and other, not making this distinction of my benefit but not yours. We don't make that distinction. And we're always trying to act in a way which benefits everyone in our sphere of influence. So if you know people who call Theravadins Hinayana, you can reference them to this paragraph of this sutta and see what they have to say. The Simile of the Acrobats is also another great sutta for shutting down the Hinayana arguments. So the Buddha sums up, he says, a monk who has these 7 qualities is worthy of gifts, worthy of hospitality, worthy of donations, worthy of respect, an unsurpassable field of merit for the world. So that's the end of the sutta.
Hannayam Dhammakataya Sadhukaram Nadamase.
Sadhu, 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 anumodami.
Thank you, Bhante, for sharing that beautiful sutta. So we have, well, welcome to a lot of friends who have joined us in the meanwhile. Too many to name each one of them. So, but I see you. And I'll go straight to the questions since we're running a little bit out of time. Angela says, is there a way to stand up for yourself and your good treatment that is in line with Dhamma? I have a meeting where I need to do that today, but I don't want to be selfish about it.
Yeah, definitely. So practice loving kindness meditation beforehand. Very important. When you speak at the right time. Speak gently. Speak with a mind of loving kindness. But you're not required to be silent. You are allowed to speak under these conditions. But the Buddha does give these guidelines. He says, first, make sure that what you're saying is true. Next, make sure that it's beneficial. And then the 3 qualities I just listed. So speak at the right time, speak gently, and speak with a mind of loving kindness. So you are allowed to criticize the conduct of other people, and you are allowed to stand up for yourself, especially if you're being treated in a harmful way, as long as you follow these five principles.
Great, thank you. And Dan says, praise and blame are worldly conditions. Yes, no? Is the praise and blame talked of here merit?
I'll actually talk about praise and blame as part of the worldly conditions on Friday, I think. So later this week, I'll be talking about a sutta on exactly that topic. So that would be a great time to talk more about it there. But here the Buddha is actually talking about blameworthy in terms of Dhamma and praiseworthy in terms of Dhamma. So not in terms of the world. But he's pointing out how, for example, someone who's not interested in listening to the Dhamma, well, that's blameworthy. And why is it blameworthy? It's blameworthy because it's unwholesome. It means that that person won't make progress towards awakening. And it also indicates that the person is not interested in making progress. Whereas someone who is interested in hearing the Dhamma, well, that's praiseworthy because it's wholesome. So here it's praise and blame in terms of wholesome and unwholesome. Whereas in the worldly conditions, praise and blame is more like being praised because you're a really good sprinter. It's like, well, who cares? Doesn't really matter at all, does it? Okay.
All right. And Amaranta asks, so why did the idea of the Bodhisattva emerge?
I don't understand what you mean by emerge, because the idea of the Bodhisattva has been around without discoverable beginning. There is no beginning to the Bodhisattva path. It's been around literally forever. Nobody invented it. It's been around for eternity. Okay, next question.
And Lloyd asks, can you talk about the difference between blameworthy and judgment of others? I'm having a hard time seeing the difference between the two in my own mind.
So I've encountered a number of people who think that judging others is inherently bad, but that's actually not correct. The Buddha never, ever, ever, ever said that we should suspend judgment. But rather, the Buddha said that we should know what is wholesome and what is unwholesome. So if you look at another person and you see unwholesome traits, that person is doing unwholesome behavior, well, then know that that's unwholesome behavior. You can call that judgmental if you like, but it's actually completely in line with Dhamma. So judgmentalism is not inherently bad. In fact, having the wisdom to know right from wrong is a good kind of judgmentalism. So yeah, you should judge wholesome and you should judge unwholesome based upon the Dhamma. Nothing wrong with that at all. In fact, that's what you should be doing. But also remember that people are not their behavior. From a Buddhist standpoint, there are no people. There's just a bundle of behaviors, all of which are subject to change. So you're never criticizing a person, but you are sometimes criticizing certain behaviors which are unwholesome and counter to Dhamma. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that's exactly what you should be doing.
And Bhante, actually, I have a follow-up question on that. How would you then differentiate fault finding from judging wholesome and unwholesome?
Yeah, so for me, when I hear the term fault finding, I think of hostility or aversion. So like the mind of looking to try to find some flaw in somebody else as a basis for attacking them. Whereas what we do practice in Buddhism at the right time, with the mind of loving kindness, we practice mutual correction, mutual admonishment. So looking to see how can I help my companions become better at practicing Buddhism. So we're not looking for some opening to attack each other, but rather we do sometimes look to see how can we help each other. And this has to be done very carefully, has to be done very gently, or else you just wind up pissing people off and sometimes making things worse. But the difference, so again, when I hear fault finding, it sounds to me like looking for opportunities to attack, as opposed to looking for opportunities to help. So I think that's the distinction I would make here. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, the intention fundamentally is the difference.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. And Vasily asks, how to skillfully meet a serious illness of a loved one?
Well, first off, recognize that this is the nature of reality. So the Buddha said all beings are subject to decay, sickness, and death. All beings are subject to losing what they love. This is just reality. So serious illness in the family, welcome to everybody's experience since forever. This is not new, and it's not unique to you. It's something which everybody goes through. It's completely normal. So I myself have had to deal with serious illness among family members. It's not special. It's not unique. It's as common as dirt. It's still really painful. It's still really difficult to go through those kinds of experiences. But first we acknowledge that it's completely natural. It's not the hand of God smiting you because he hates you. It's just nature. That's all. It's just as natural as the leaves falling from the trees in the fall. It's just as natural as the flowers withering in summer. There's nothing surprising here, and there's nothing wrong here. So then there's two questions, which is one, how do you take care of yourself in this situation? And two, how do you look after the person who's sick? So in terms of yourself, you're going to be practicing equanimity, because that's really all you can do. And in terms of the other person, you're going to be practicing compassion, which is constantly looking to see, what can I do to help this person? What can I do to help reduce their suffering? What can I do to help look after them and take care of them? if there's a way to help them get better, how can I help them get better? If there's nothing to do that will make them recover, if it's a fatal illness and there's nothing to be done about that, then what can I do to make them comfortable as they get closer to the end of their life? So that's your practice, equanimity and compassion. Okay?
Great, and that was the last question. Thank you, Bhante. Unless there's a question maybe from live audience.
Go ahead.
I had a question regarding generosity. Can you speak to generosity to oneself, and also talking about generosity tied with relinquishment and letting go, using that? And I think commonly generosity is thought of giving to others, how giving to oneself to help ourselves along the path. Does that make sense?
Generosity to yourself. Yeah, so I think one of the problems that we sometimes get into in Buddhist practice is pushing ourselves too hard, and just making ourselves miserable. So when you speak about generosity to yourself, I think about giving yourself time, giving yourself a sense of ease, giving yourself a sense of spaciousness and serenity. So instead of always pushing yourself to do more and be more and achieve more, just give yourself the opportunity to just relax. Like, just hang out on the back porch with a cup of iced tea for an hour. Like, you don't always need to be doing something. And there was a second part to your question. What was the second part?
That was really good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Right, so maybe that's all for this morning. Thank you, Bhante, and thank you all for joining in. We will be meeting again this evening at 7:30 p.m. and again tomorrow 8 a.m. and 7:30 p.m. and Friday again 8 a.m. and 7:30 p.m. New York City time. If you have any lingering questions on Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, you can bring them for monk chat on Friday evening, and a panel of monastics will give you hopefully some answers to that. All right, so we can end with 3 sadhus.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.